Thank you, Senator Wright. Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. It's a particular pleasure as a West Australian senator to rise and make a contribution to this debate about repealing the former Labor government's mining tax. And I'm surprised that Senator Ludlam hasn't rushed into the chamber to ask Senator Wright to sit down, because if West Australians are listening to the broadcast today, they would have heard Senator Wright talk about strengthening the mining tax. They would have heard Senator Wright talking about the mining tax being a shadow of itself, Senator Ludlam is going to pay the price for that speech on the 5th of April. Senator Ludlam is going to pay a very heavy price for that speech on the 5th of April. I hope it goes viral. I hope it goes viral. There is no better symbol. There's no better symbol of the Labor Party's complete inability to understand Western Australia than its continued support of this tax. It's no coincidence that Labor's federal representation in Western Australia now stands at a historic low. Labor's primary vote in Western Australia on the 7th of September last year was just 28.7%. Senators on the other side won't be surprised by that, because I regularly refer to it in this place. But there's a very, very good reason for that. It's because West Australians have formed the view, correctly in my mind, that over the last 6 years of the Rudd and Gillard governments, they were seen as a cash cow for Canberra. Labor was more than happy to take Western Australia's money, yet reluctant to spend it on any West Australian initiatives, or listen to the concerns of Western Australians across a range of issues. Together with the carbon tax, Labor's mining tax will forever serve as a prime example of the former government's complete fiscal and political ineptitude. The mining tax has a long history. It runs like a river through almost all of the previous government's time in office. Along the way, it caused division and suspicion within the government, significantly contributing to the downfall of one Prime Minister and haunted another right to the very end of her period in office. Of greater concern to me, however, is the damage this tax has done to Australia's mining and resources sector, which is so vital not only to the interests of my own state of Western Australia, but it underpins the ongoing strength of our national economy. The fact at the moment is that when Western Australia is diminished, we are all diminished. What we've come now to know as the Minerals Resource Rent Tax had its genesis in the Henry Tax Review, which was commissioned by the first Rudd government. That review put forward the idea that became the Resource Super Profits Tax. The original forecast was that this tax would raise just $50 billion in 5 years from July 2012. The original forecast was that this tax would raise just under $50 billion in the 5 years from July 2012. This tax was lobbed like a grenade into the boardrooms of Australia's mining companies. It was announced by former Prime Minister Rudd and former Treasurer, the member for Lilly, with virtually no consultation whatsoever. Needless to say, the reaction from the mining sector and much of the wider community, I might add, particularly in Western Australia, was swift and savage. The Rudd Labor government seemed genuinely surprised by the intensity of the opposition to its plan, which goes to show just how much Labor understands the nature of business in Australia, goes to show how much Labor understands Western Australia. The mining companies, as it is their right, worked together and developed an advertising campaign to alert Australians to the broader implications of this tax and the damage it would do to our economy overall. Labor's reaction was to do what it does best, to launch a political advertising campaign in opposition using taxpayers' money. It's perhaps an insight into the siege mentality under which former Prime Minister Rudd operated, but what's often forgotten in discussions surrounding the mining tax was that the former Prime Minister regarded it as a matter of the utmost importance. We all recall his pronouncement that climate change was the greatest moral challenge of our time. Less well remembered was his strident insistence that the introduction of his mining super profits tax constituted a national emergency. I refer to a report from the Age newspaper on the 29th of May 2010, which read as follows. The Rudd government has crashed through its own accountability guidelines to rush $38 million worth of tax reform advertisements to air in an effort to counter a negative blitz by the mining sector. In order to rush the campaign to air, the government suspended its own processes for having officials check that advertisements are free from party political content. Special Minister of State Senator Joe Ludwig has scoped to ignore the guidelines in cases of national emergency, extreme urgency or other compelling reasons. That is an insight into the mindset of the Labor Party. A group of private companies choose to spend their own money to highlight the dangers of government policy. And Labor responds as though it were wartime, suspending normal processes and virtually declaring a national emergency in order to use public money to suit its own ends. This from the same Labor Party that now comes into the Senate and preaches about transparency and accountability. Of course, it was wartime, but the war was happening inside the government. For those senators who may not yet have had the chance, I commend to you an excellent series of articles in the Fairfax Press last year by Peter Harcher, which examines the collapse of the previous government in lurid detail. It's a 5-part series, but Part 3 is particularly instructive as it sets out events surrounding the coup that removed Mr Rudd as Prime Minister in June 2010. It's worth placing on the record the key role the mining tax played in those events. The mining tax, the newspaper report says, the mining tax was the policy backdrop to the political machinations. After breaking an election policy by postponing the carbon emissions trading scheme, Rudd had launched immediately into the announcement of a super profits tax on coal and iron ore. Mr Ferguson says, "We announced the tax on the Sunday. By the end of the week we had lost the debate. The industry had been told that the potential revenue would not be included in the forthcoming budget. The next week it was not only booked in the budget, it was allocated to be spent." The article goes on, "A furious Rudd privately blamed Wayne Swan for bungling the consultations with the companies in the states. Swan denied the accusation. Of course, we now know what happened the following month. Mr Swan banded together with the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard and disposed of a Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd." The ascendancy of former Prime Minister Julia Gillard also meant the super profits tax was off the agenda, replaced by the minerals resource rent tax, the tax that the coalition is now determined to abolish. When the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard came to office, she set about portraying herself as the great negotiator, presumably in contrast to the autocratic style and approach of her predecessor. The MRRT was portrayed as Exhibition A of the new Prime Minister's marvellous conciliatory approach. So let's take a look at what Australia got as a result of this arrangement, an arrangement that she struck with Australia's 3 biggest mining companies, and it's worth remembering that negotiation was very, very limited. The first point was that the revenue take from the tax was significantly revised, from the almost $50 billion projected under Kevin Rudd to around $26.5 billion under the new iteration negotiated by former Prime Minister Gillard. That was the first reduction in the revenue forecast. It wasn't the last. Labor's inability to get the basics right was demonstrated again and again as we saw write-down after write-down in the projections of what the mining tax would raise. In February last year, the then Treasurer, the member for Lilly, who was instrumental in the negotiations that delivered the MRRT, was forced to concede that in the first 6 months of its operation, the mining tax had raised just $126 million. $126 million from a tax that was designed to raise tens of billions of dollars. So former Prime Minister Gillard's much-vaunted negotiating skills and the member for Lilly's economic management skills succeeded in creating a tax that raised virtually none of its projected revenue, yet added significantly to businesses' compliance costs. There are only around 20 companies in all that have actually had to pay the mining tax, yet there are around 145 other mining companies that have been required to submit all the paperwork for it. So you have around 145 companies required to pay accountants, lawyers and other advisors so they can meet the compliance requirements and submit paperwork for a tax they ultimately have not been required to pay. How many millions of dollars has this wasted? How many jobs could have been created, or what new projects supported had this government not erred so appallingly in the design and implementation of this mining tax? This is a real tribute to Labor's economic skill. A tax is a design that significantly increases business costs in the mining sector, harms economic growth and job creation in the resources industry, destroys a Prime Minister, yet at the same time raises no revenue. It's a remarkable accomplishment. It's a remarkable accomplishment. Only the Australian Labor Party could have done it, and bizarrely they are still defending it. Is that a defence, Senator Gallagher? Removing this tax will restore confidence in our mining sector. It will allow our resources companies to get on with the business instead of having to spend time complying with paperwork requirements for a tax which doesn't raise revenue. The mining sector is very, very important to the West Australian economy and to the national economy as a whole. Direct employment in the minerals industry in 2013 was almost 250,000 people, an increase of 40% in the previous 3 years. Of these workers, 95% of them are full-time employees, and the average full-time salary for workers in the mining sector is close to $130,000 a year. If you extrapolate that out, that's approximately $10 billion in personal income tax that the mining companies generate through the wages of their employees. Yet the former Labor government thought it was a good idea to depress employment growth in the sector by hitting it with another new tax. It does beggar belief. Of course, the sector contributes to the Australian society in broader ways. In 2011-12, as an example, mining companies in Australia spent $35 billion in community infrastructure and the employment of local contractors in regional areas, as well as the support of Indigenous communities in regional areas. Yet if you listen to the rhetoric of the Labor Party, it's always about portraying miners as greedy and selfish and as being people unwilling to contribute to society more broadly. It is a cheap and inaccurate caricature, one that I would have hoped we'd left behind long ago. Sadly, under former Prime Ministers Rudd and Gillard, faux-class war was all the rage. I had thought that perhaps the defeat of the former government and the election of its new leader, Labor may have left this sort of rhetoric behind. Alas, many of the comments coming from Labor members and senators over the last 6 months have shown this hope to be forlorn. Of course, there is another aspect to this tax, one that is having implications much wider than just the mining sector. As I outlined earlier, this tax has raised barely 1/10 of the revenue it was projected to bring in. It has brought in around $400 million in total. Yet, seemingly undeterred by reality, the former Labor government locked in $16.7 billion in expenditure, all supposed to be funded through this flawed mining tax. There were no shortage of self-serving and cynical actions undertaken by the former Labor government, but this one has to rank near the top of a long list. And who is hurt by this craven and cynical approach to public policy making? It's those communities, local communities, many of them smaller regional communities, who were promised the earth by the former Labor government and who now find that the money they were promised for the completion of local infrastructure projects or other activities doesn't exist or never existed. Labor ministers, and many of them remain in this parliament and on its front bench, ran around Australia before the election making a raft of promises in marginal seats, all to be funded by revenue raised by a mining tax they knew was flawed and was not bringing in anything like the revenue that they had originally been forecast. The level of cynicism is still breathtaking to many of us. I can think of several instances in my own state of Western Australia where local communities in the Great Southern region were told by the then Labor government that key local projects would be funded through the Regional Development Australia Fund and the Regional Infrastructure Fund. The ministers knew there was no money in the fund because it was all supposed to be funded by a mining tax that was not raising revenue, yet they kept making promises and misleading regional communities in an attempt to buy votes. It just goes to show how little respect this Labor Party has for regional communities around Australia, but particularly in my home state of Western Australia, that they would mislead people in this way. Worse still, now that the coalition is in government and has to try and sort out Labor's mess, the very same Labor Party is trying to prevent it by opposing these bills and continuing to support a mining tax that everyone agrees does not work. Yet we are hearing from the Labor Party, what we are hearing from the Labor Party is the same tired rhetoric, class rhetoric about big miners and millionaires. I think one of the more eloquent criticisms, even if it was merely an implicit one, of Labor's resort to class warfare during the Rudd and Gillard era came from within Labor itself. The former Minister for Resources and now the former member for Batman, Mr Ferguson, was forced to resign from the ministry last year during one of Labor's regular leadership stoushes. Subsequent to that, Mr Ferguson announced on the 29th of May last year that he would be leaving the parliament. During his final speech in the House of Representatives on that day, he said this: "When I look back on my career, firstly at the Miscellaneous Workers' Union, then as ACTU President, and finally as a Member of Parliament, my main motivation has been to get Australians into decent, well-paying jobs. This is what the Labor Party means to me, helping those less fortunate in life by providing new jobs and opportunities to achieve a better quality of life. Creating opportunities by working with business is not the same thing as pointless class rhetoric. In essence, we need to grow the pie to share it. In essence, we need to grow the pie to share it," he said. This is valuable advice, and advice that Labor should heed. By refusing to support this legislation and continuing to support the mining tax, the Labor Party is essentially thumbing its nose at the people of Australia who, with their votes on the 7th of September last year, expressed their strong support for the Coalition's clear and long-standing commitment to scrapping the mining tax. Last week, the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Shorten, was in my home state of Western Australia. He was there to try and win support for the upcoming Senate election. During his visit, he gave an interview to Sky News' David Spears. It was one of the most excruciating public performances many of us would have ever seen, and it's worth watching again. And it's important to watch again for what it doesn't actually say. 5 times David Spears, remembering that the leader of the Labor Party, Mr Shorten, is in Western Australia, 5 times David Spears asked the Leader of the Opposition whether he and his party still support the mining tax. 5 times Mr Shorten replied with waffling, equivocation and stonewalling, refusing to admit that what we all know is true, that Labor still wants this mining tax, but are desperate to avoid saying so before April the 5th. However, I do have to applaud one federal Labor MP from Western Australia in my last remaining minutes, whose candour, wrong-headed as it might be on this policy issue, at least provides a welcome contrast with the tricky, dishonest approach of Labor's current leader. I'm speaking of the newly minted Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Western Australia, the member for Perth, Alana McTiernan. When she was appointed to her new position with great fanfare by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Shorten said that Ms McTiernan's appointment would make WA's voice inside Labor even stronger. Sadly for the people of Western Australia, it was clear within 24 hours that this strong new voice was singing from a very old hymn sheet. Far from heeding the lessons of last September or using her new responsibilities to actually stand up for the people of WA, Ms McTiernan immediately declared her strong support for Labor's flawed mining tax, saying it was sound and that there were strong arguments in favour of keeping this failed tax. I'm not sure where Ms McTiernan and the Labor Party have been hearing these strong arguments that support their tax, perhaps from their allies in the Australian Greens movement, but I sincerely doubt that they've emanated from my home state of Western Australia. This legislation to abolish Labor's disastrous mining tax is a core element of the Coalition's plan to restore confidence not just in the mining sector but across the Australian economy more broadly. It shows that Australia again has a government that values the contribution that the mining and resources sector makes to the strength and growth of our national economy and understands the best thing that government government can do is to get out of the way and allow them to get on with the job. This legislation will help close the book on a long, drawn-out saga of the Rudd-Gillard leadership wrangle, the incompetence that underpinned the 6 years of the Labor government and the anti-WA policy agenda that Labor and their Greens allies have long pursued.